Welcome to week 10, everyone. Glad that you've made it to this point in the course as we near the end. I know that your minds are probably occupied, at least in this course, with the advanced interpretive paper. And I gave you a little bit of further orientation about that in the video last week. I want to add a little something to that now as you're actually revising one another's papers, reviewing them, and touching up your own throughout this week. I then will offer a little bit of intro to the content of what is really the last section of the main argument of Paul's letter to the Romans that we'll be studying together in this week 10. So first of all, a few further words about the advanced interpretive paper as you're putting it together. As you're touching it up, since hopefully by now you've had at least a full draft of your paper on your Google Doc. But what I want you to be thinking about is whether you've done justice to what I might describe as 3 levels of analysis or approach to the interpretation of your passage. And those 3 levels of analysis that I think are really important for interpreting any epistle, any letter in the New Testament, and especially Romans, are first, interpreting, analyzing where the passage sits as a whole in the flow of the letter and what gives rise to the passage in that rhetorical flow. That's the first level, and I think the most important, quite honestly. Second level is how then that passage as a whole develops in chunks that we might call paragraphs. Your interpretation should be able to discern and articulate how the force of the whole develops in those stages that we could call paragraphs. And that means identifying, clarifying what the connection is between each paragraph and the next. And then finally, the third level of analysis, which is in many ways, I think, the least important, at least compared to the first 2 that I've said. It's not that this is unimportant, but ironically, this is where a lot of the commentaries that you're reading are living. I don't think that they're spending enough time often at those first 2 levels, and they're focused on this third level of what I might call nuts and bolts, which is where you're trying to tease out, clarify the meaning of particular sentences or particular phrases like according to the flesh, or key terms like boasting. And I think that what you want to do when you get to this level of analysis at various points in your paper is you want to be drawing on the constraints that have been provided by those first 2 levels of analysis. Those are what bring the key terms, the key phrases, the flow of the sentences into focus. And if you ignore those larger levels of analysis, when you're diving into the nuts and bolts, you'll start defining terms and kind of making sense of them in a context that is rather alien to the one in which they appear in the letter. And that will tend to distort, I think, their meaning in the letter rather than to reflect it. So those 3 levels are what you want to be mindful of and to be thinking of those in terms of how you're organizing your paper, presenting it. You want to be sure that you set up the argument of your paper at the beginning well, provide a frame for why you're going to say what you're going to say. And thinking about these 3 levels of analysis from the very beginning can help you to do that. Okay, second part of the intro video here is just to orient you a little bit to the content that is coming this week. What you're going to find as the forum prompts for this week indicate is that as Paul comes to the final segment of his argument in Romans, the pastoral, political, rhetorical concerns that have animated the letter from its beginning become explicit. And so this is really important to pay attention to, because if we have been interpreting earlier parts of the letter, say the language of judgment or justification or according to the flesh or God's election, all of these terms that we've been wrestling with in a way that is oblivious to how the argument of the letter as a whole lands, then I think that our interpretations will have been poor. And so I'm eager for you to be wrestling with how it is that these pastoral concerns at the end of the letter are in fact what has, you might say, anchored the language of the letter from the very beginning. And this is often something that I find is ignored in a lot of the commentary tradition and other approaches to the text, where we think that something like justification by faith has some abstract general meaning that then Paul applies to how people share the table with one another. And I think it's actually the opposite. The doctrinal teaching, you might say, of Paul's has always arisen from concrete contexts and is always addressed to concrete contexts. And so we want the way Paul actually speaks to those concrete contexts directly in this final section of Romans to constrain our sense of what the key language of Romans has been about from the beginning. The idea here is not to restrict the meaning or the reach of Romans to an overly narrow pastoral or political context that we might regard as remote from our own. It's instead to respect the particular color of this language, so that as the language reverberates and reaches beyond its own immediate context, it will do so in a way that is consonant with the particulars that gave rise to that language and that shaped its meaning. So I don't think that what I'm saying implies a restriction on the reach of Romans. I think instead it's aimed at, you might say, nourishing a reach of Romans that can go as far as the four winds and the ends of the earth, but in a way that is faithful to the pastoral particulars that animate this language. So that's what I'm after. I hope that that's something that comes through in the podcast exposition and that you're struck by as we come to the end, since Romans so often has been read as a kind of encyclopedia for key Christian doctrine, and people sort of parachute in to get some general teaching about salvation or something like that. And because that sort of approach is oblivious to the pastoral concerns of the letter as a whole, the doctrines of salvation that emerge from that sort of interpretation of Romans, I think, are characterized by a systematic distortion and then often misuse. Now, as I'm saying, this final section of the letter, no different from what we've seen thus far, is full of rhetorical art and subtlety, all kinds of intricacy. There's irony in what Paul says, that sort of thing. And so we want to read it carefully so that we're attending to those rhetorical dynamics. And just to illustrate one particular case where you're going to see this that I want to call your attention to, and you will hear me dealing with this in the podcast exposition. But when Paul comes to the last segment, Romans 14, 1 to about 15, 13, last segment of his argument, he is going to shift in his language to some terms that he hasn't used and mix them with a bunch of terms that he has used. So he's suddenly going to address the audience in terms of strong and weak. And you're going to find that commentators and maybe your own intuitions are inclined to immediately transpose that language into Gentiles and Jews, as if Paul were saying that The Jews to whom he's writing are the weak because they still have all kinds of convictions about what foods you can't eat and what days and times you must celebrate in a certain way, and that he means by the strong Gentiles who don't have any of those worries. And the force of the passage is then construed as trying to de-Judaize Christian practice, as if everyone were supposed to be aiming to be strong, and we sort of patronize the weak along the way. As you can tell by the way that I'm presenting it, I don't think that is a good interpretation. Quite clearly, Paul is perfectly capable of using the terms Jew and Gentile, Jew and Greek, as he has throughout the letter. So I think that we should respect his choice of strong and weak and allow that to, you might say, complicate and even soften some of the edges of the different backgrounds and customs and commitments from which people are coming as they gather around the table for a shared life in this last section of the letter. And in fact, I don't think that the weak are necessarily Jews. I don't think that the strong are necessarily non-Jews. I think that there's something quite a bit more subtle going on, but the effect of this switch in Paul's language is to, you might say, soften some of the inherited boundaries and to urge people to negotiate their differences according to different terms that are going to question how the existing boundaries have hardened. And I'm talking about boundaries in practice, boundaries in conviction. And in questioning that, to urge people to negotiate these boundaries again and again in a dynamic encounter with one another, where the needs of the neighbor, the needs of the sister, the brother gathered around the table are prioritized. And that sort of mutuality will have an effect on those inherited boundaries and distribution of power and create new possibilities. That, I think, is what the hospitality of the kingdom of God is all about, according to Paul in this section. So resist that urge to think that Paul is simply using some easy code for Jews and Gentiles when he says strong and weak, and instead try to think about how he's actually using strong and weak. And as you'll hear me suggest in the podcast, to address the strong only to subvert in the course of doing so what it means to be strong. In the same way that he has talked about boasting earlier in the letter, only to subvert the meaning of boasting, talked about judgment, only to subvert what it means for judgment to happen if Jesus himself is the judge. So there's a pattern here to Paul's almost poetic use of language that I think we should respect and use as our guide as we get into the word choice and approach that he takes in this final section of the letter. I look forward to your reactions and to our conversation this week. God bless you as you study this week, and hope that you find the material, and especially just the text of Romans itself, inspiring for your life as a Christian, perhaps as a teacher, certainly as a person of influence in whichever setting that you live, and that you're able to draw analogously on what Paul teaches the communities in Rome in your context, where I have no doubt that you're facing tensions that are similar, difficulties and challenges that could use the wisdom of Paul's gospel.